Joseph Stalin, revolutionary, Marxist-Leninist, the leader of the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet Union. Stalin was an outstanding theoretician of Marxism and one of the greatest men of his time, which was recognized even by the enemies of the USSR. However, after the death of Stalin, his role in history was radically revised. Anti-Stalinist hysteria has generated a large number of myths which are used as anti-communist propaganda. Who was Joseph Stalin in reality, and what role did he play in the history of the Soviet Union? Myth number 1. Stalin was a bloody tyrant. In 1956, during the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev criticized Joseph Stalin in a secret report and put forward a number of charges, the leading of which were Stalin's so-called purges. A further anti-Stalinist campaign in the USSR, which had begun during the Perestroika, brought this topic to the point of absurdity. The very existence of repressions began to be explained by Stalin's maniacal inclinations, as he allegedly wanted to destroy as many people as possible. In fact, the so-called purges were far from as widespread as liberal and conservative ideologists imagine. According to Russian historian Viktor Semskov, from 1921 to 1953, about 4 million people were convicted of counter-revolutionary crimes. Of these, about 1.4 million were convicted during the years 1937 to 1938. Of these, about 680,000 were sentenced to death. Between 1918 and 1958, about 400 million people lived on the territory of the USSR, and no more than 2.5% of Soviet citizens suffered from purges. In reality, about 97.5% of the USSR population was not subjected to any repression at all. This strategy of focusing on Stalin's actions is an attempt of businessmen to hide their wealth. They do not want us to talk about how they received their wealth by exploiting workers, but rather about Stalin. The ruling class of capitalists uses all possible means to maintain their power. Right now, monopolies all over the planet are repressing many people in the interests of a handful of oligarchs. And since the capitalists apply repressions against their opponents, so should the proletariat. It can and must punish those who oppose the power of the working class and steal what was produced by the workers. The repressions in the USSR were aimed not at the maximum destruction of the people, as modern ideologists are trying to imagine, but at the struggle against counter-revolution, which means against those who tried to destroy socialism and restore the old order. The aggravation of the class struggle during the construction of socialism led to the intensification of anti-Soviet activity by a number of opportunists from the left and right wings in the party, as well as other anti-Soviet elements and foreign agents. Hundreds of volumes of investigative documents related to the trials of opposition leaders, conspirators, and traitors in state security agencies and the armed forces indicate that most of the convicts were indeed guilty. Of course, there were mistakes. The situation was worsened by some party secretaries and leaders of the NKVD, who wanted to strengthen their positions by fighting the enemies of the people too hard, which sometimes led to unjustified accusations of Soviet citizens. As a result, the reasons of why the purges occurred do not lie in the plane of the personal will of Stalin, but were caused by a number of objective reasons and the historical situation of the USSR in the 30s. Myth number 2. Stalin was a bad commander. In his report and memoirs, Khrushchev noted that in the early days of the Great Patriotic War, Stalin was psychologically depressed and absent from the workplace, was hiding in the countryside, and only the Politburo could bring him back to work. A similar version of events exists in the memoirs of Anastas Mikoyan, though its origins are questionable. However, as evidenced by the published journal of visits to Stalin's office, he spent all the first days of the German attack working hard in his cabinet in the Kremlin and regularly met visitors, among whom were many party, military, and government officials. Stalin did not leave his post even in the most dangerous days of the war. In the fall of 1941, instead of evacuating, he preferred to stay in besieged Moscow and continue working and encouraging people. An important event was the parade of November 7th in honor of the 24th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. Stalin's speech, delivered from the Lenin Mausoleum, was of great political significance for the Soviet Union and strengthen the fighting spirit of the entire Soviet people. The report on the cult of personality also noted the negative role of Stalin as commander-in-chief, whose interference in the course of operations allegedly led to negative consequences. In reality, Stalin took an active part in discussing and developing military plans. For example, the encirclement and defeat of Nazi armies in Stalingrad, the victorious Battle of Kursk, and liberation of Belarus were only several of these plans which Stalin actively participated in. During 10 strategic operations developed with the participation of Stalin, by the end of 1944, all Soviet territory was liberated from the Nazis. These operations will go down in history as the 10 Stalin strikes. This is how Marshal Vasilevsky, the chief of the General Staff of the Red Army, rated Stalin as the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. In my deep conviction, Joseph Stalin was the strongest and most colorful figure in the Strategic Command, especially from the second half of the Great Patriotic War. He successfully carried out the leadership on all fronts, mobilized all the country's military efforts on the basis of the party line, and was able to make a significant influence on the leading political and military leaders of the Allied countries during the war. Contrary to the anti-Soviet myths, Stalin was a capable military and political leader who made a huge contribution to building the victory over fascism. Myth number 3, Stalin was religious. Stalin actively conducted and supported the struggle against religion throughout the 1920s and 1930s. At the 15th Congress of the Bolshevik Party, Joseph Stalin, among the existing problems of the Soviet regime, noted the weakening of anti-religious propaganda. Therefore, it's completely unreasonable to attribute the pre-war anti-religious policy to only Trotskyists and other opponents of Stalin. After the start of World War II, some historians note the curtailment of anti-religious politics in the USSR and the turn of Stalin to orthodoxy. As evidence, they give the meeting of the locum tenens of the Russian Orthodox Church's patriarchal throne with Stalin in the Kremlin, as well as the establishment of the patriarchal throne. However, all of this is not proof that Stalin became religious. The change in the policy of the Soviet government in relations with the Russian Orthodox Church was caused by the need to enlist the support of the higher clergy and oppose the German plan to use the Russian Orthodox Church abroad against the Soviet people during the war. However, there was no question of using religious propaganda at the front and changing the policies of the Communist Party, which have always relied on scientific atheism. There is also a legend that in the winter of 1941, on Stalin's personal order, a plane with the icon of St. Maria flew around Moscow, and only thanks to this act did the Russians manage to save their capital city. Of course, this is a fabrication of anti-communists that is absolutely without merit. They try and minimize the real efforts of the Soviet people who saved Moscow from the capture of the Nazis without any icons, but with real weapons. There was never a place for icons in Stalin's office, as well as in his apartments, and Joseph Stalin himself, being the commander-in-chief, was never baptized or prayed. Stalin was a communist, and contrary to the anti-Soviet Red Monarch myth, he maintained his atheistic beliefs until the end of his life. Myth number 4. Stalin was a Russian nationalist and anti-Semite. During the period of active construction of socialism in the USSR, the Russian people achieved great success which was never before possible. Under Soviet power, millions of Russian people finally gained access to modern education, perfectly mastered their language, and met the previously inaccessible Great Russian culture, which led to its development and enrichment on new communist principles. In his writings and public speeches, Joseph Stalin repeatedly expressed respect to the Russian people. These facts allow the opponents of Marxism to portray Stalin as a Russian sovereign and nationalist. But if you look carefully at the history of the Soviet state, it turns out that in addition to the Russian people, other peoples of the USSR also prospered. The population, due to the widespread improvement of living standards during the period of Stalin's leadership, grew among all nationalities. Under Stalin, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Georgian, Armenian, and other nations were given the opportunity to speak and study in their native languages freely, while many languages of small nations gained an alphabet for the first time in their history. In addition to nationalism, they also attribute anti-Semitism to Stalin, which sounds absurd as we remember the nationality of many great Soviet people at the time. One of Stalin's closest comrades was Lazar Kaganovich, an outstanding Bolshevik and People's Commissar, as well as being of Jewish nationality. Many laureates of the Stalin Prize were Jewish. For example, the directors Julie Reisman, Mikhail Rohm, and Sergei Einstein were awarded the Stalin Prize more than once. As a true Marxist, Joseph Stalin sharply criticized any manifestations of chauvinism. For example, this is what Stalin replied at a request from the Jewish Telegraph Agency from America. Anti-Semitism, as an extreme form of racial chauvinism, is the most dangerous remnant of cannibalism. In the USSR, anti-Semitism is strictly prosecuted by law as a phenomenon deeply hostile to the Soviet system. Active anti-Semites are punished under the laws of the USSR with the death penalty. Myth number 5. Stalin killed Lenin's guard. After the death of Lenin, a tough struggle broke out between the various groups within the Bolshevik Party. As a result of this confrontation, a victory was won by a group led by Stalin, which expressed the position of the majority of the party. Opposition figures, who only hid behind the name of Lenin and in fact, contrary to his principles, sowed separation and factionalism within the party, were removed from their posts. Many were expelled from the party ranks, and one of the main anti-party figures, Leon Trotsky, was expelled abroad. It was Trotsky who in the 1930s who began to interpret open trials against the Trotskyists and the right wing as a reprisal against the old Bolsheviks and the Leninist Guard. But Trotsky himself, who was at first a Menshevik and then stood between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, could not be a Bolshevik. But Stalin was. The old Bolsheviks included Stalin, who, unlike many others, always supported Lenin's point of view in important discussions. In addition, many old Bolsheviks under Stalin continued to work in the party and were not subjected to any repression. Among them are Molotov, Kalinin, Kaganovich, Kollontai, Podvoisky, Yaroslavsky, Vladimirsky, and others. Repressions against the old party leaders such as Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and others were far from belonging to the Leninist circle. Sentences have also been handed down, primarily for specific crimes against Soviet power. Therefore, all the accusations against Stalin for the reprisal against the old guard are completely unfounded. Stalin personifies a whole era in the history of the Soviet state. Rapid economic growth and the victory of socialism are inextricably connected with his name. It made the Soviet state a powerful stronghold of the world communist movement and created a strong power to oppose capitalists all over the world. Therefore, today minions of capitalism everywhere try and blacken Stalin's name, as he was an outstanding communist and revolutionary. However, decades of anti-Stalin propaganda could not shake its popularity with the masses. As long as oppression and exploitation exist, as long as all wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of the oligarchs, the people all around the world will continue to turn to Lenin and Stalin, who have become a symbol of the struggle for the bright future of all mankind. Stay tuned.